March 4, 1942, Saint-Nazaire, occupied France, where the Atlantic coast meets the Loire estuary. Oberleutnant Werner Hartmann stood watch on the massive dry dock that held Germany's prize battleships, the only facility on the Atlantic capable of servicing the Tirpitz. The night was quiet, unusually so. At 01:34 hours, Hartmann heard something impossible, the sound of a British destroyer's engines growing louder, heading directly toward the dock gates at full speed. Before he could process what was happening, HMS Campbelltown, packed with 5 tons of delayed action explosives, rammed the dock gates at 17 knots and embedded itself in the massive steel structure. What followed was 18 minutes of chaos that German defenders would later describe as fighting shadows. British commandos poured from the destroyer and accompanying motor launches, moving through darkness with supernatural coordination. They destroyed pump houses, wrecked machinery, killed defenders, and vanished into the night before German reinforcements arrived. 12 hours later, the Campbelltown exploded, destroying the dock completely. Hartmann survived and spent the rest of the war trying to explain what he'd witnessed. His report used a phrase that would appear in dozens of German after-action accounts. They fought like ghosts, visible one moment, gone the next, attacking from impossible angles. The British Commandos had become legend, and that legend was earned in blood and darkness. To understand why German soldiers described British Commandos as ghosts requires understanding what commandos actually were and how radically they differed from conventional soldiers. The Commandos were born in summer 1940, during Britain's darkest hour. France had fallen. The British Army had evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving most equipment behind, and invasion seemed imminent. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, demanded offensive action despite Britain's defensive posture. His directive was simple: we must develop a reign of terror down the enemy coast. The result was the formation of Special Service Brigade, soon renamed Commandos after the Boer guerrilla fighters who'd harassed British forces 40 years earlier. The organizational structure was revolutionary. Unlike conventional infantry companies with hundreds of soldiers, commando units were small, initially just 450 men per unit, organized into troops of 65. Recruitment was voluntary and selective. Officers posted notices across British military bases. Wanted, volunteers for special service of a hazardous nature. Thousands applied. Selection was brutal. Candidates faced endurance marches carrying heavy loads, night navigation tests, swimming in full gear, cliff climbing, and intensive combat training. Psychological assessment was equally important. They wanted men who could think independently, improvise under pressure, and maintain aggression despite fear. Roughly 60% washed out. Those who passed entered a training regime unlike anything in British military practice. They learned unarmed combat from specialists in jiu-jitsu and street fighting. They practiced with German weapons until handling them became instinctive. They trained in darkness until night became their preferred operating environment. They learned demolitions, navigation by stars, silent communication through hand signals, cliff scaling, small boat handling, and most critically, speed and violence of action. The doctrine was simple: hit hard, hit fast, vanish before the enemy can respond. Training took place in Scotland, in the rugged highlands where weather was miserable and terrain unforgiving. Commandos learned to operate in conditions that would incapacitate normal soldiers: cold, wet, exhausted, hungry, but still capable of complex military operations. The training philosophy was deliberate: make training harder than combat, so combat feels manageable. By early 1941, the first commando units were ready. They weren't soldiers in the conventional sense, they were raiders, specialized for amphibious assault, night operations, demolition, and what would later be called surgical strikes. The German military, preparing for the invasion of Russia, had no equivalent units and no doctrine for countering them. The early commando raids established the pattern and the reputation. In March 1941, Operation Claymore struck the Lofoten Islands off Norway. 600 commandos landed, destroyed fish oil factories critical to German glycerin production, captured German soldiers and Norwegian collaborators, recruited Norwegian volunteers, and departed before German forces could respond. The operation lasted 6 hours. German defenders reported confusion. The British appeared everywhere simultaneously, executed complex operations with precision, and vanished before we understood what was happening. In December 1941, Operation Archery targeted the Norwegian island of Vågsøy. This raid was larger, over 500 commandos plus naval support, but the tactics remained consistent. They landed in darkness, moved through the town in small teams, destroyed specific targets, and withdrew under fire. The German garrison fought back fiercely, but they were reacting while commandos were executing rehearsed plans. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. German commanders defending coastal positions realized they faced a new problem. Any point along thousands of miles of coastline could be hit at any time. They couldn't predict where or when. Defensive measures consumed enormous resources: guards, patrols, coastal artillery, quick reaction forces, all positioned to defend against raids that might never come to that specific location. The resource equation favored Britain. A few hundred commandos forced Germany to spread thousands of soldiers across coastal defense. But it was the night operations that created the ghost reputation. Commandos trained extensively for darkness, learning to move silently, to navigate without lights, to communicate without sound, to fight at close quarters when visual identification was nearly impossible. They wore darkened uniforms, blackened their faces, removed anything that might reflect light or make noise. More importantly, they trained until night movement became natural. Most soldiers are uncomfortable in darkness. Visibility is reduced, direction becomes uncertain, fear increases. Commandos trained until they were more comfortable at night than during day. They learned to use darkness as camouflage and weapon. German defenders, by contrast, relied on static defenses, bunkers, gun positions, searchlights. When raids came at night, defenders were pinned to their positions, limited by their own defensive infrastructure, while attackers moved freely through darkness. The defenders could see only what searchlights illuminated, while commandos, their eyes adapted to darkness, could see defensive positions silhouetted against their own lights. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. German after-action reports consistently noted this asymmetry. We could not see them, but they could see us. The raid that cemented the ghost reputation was Operation Biting in February 1942, the assault on a German radar installation at Bruneval on the French coast. This operation demonstrated the full sophistication of commando tactics. The target was a Würzburg radar system that German forces used for directing night fighters against RAF bombers. British intelligence wanted the radar captured intact for technical analysis. The operation required parachute insertion, a technical demolition team, fierce combat against defenders, and evacuation by sea, all at night, all precisely coordinated. Major John Frost led 120 paratroopers and commandos. They dropped at 0:15 hours, assembled in darkness, and moved toward the radar station in 3 assault groups. The German garrison, approximately 100 soldiers, detected the attack only when commandos were already at the perimeter. The assault lasted 12 minutes. Commandos used suppressed weapons and grenades to clear defenders, while a specialist team dismantled critical radar components. German reinforcements, alerted by the fighting, rushed toward the position, but commandos were already withdrawing toward the beach. The evacuation was the most vulnerable phase. Commandos reached the beach at 02:15 hours and waited for Royal Navy landing craft. German forces, now fully alert, moved toward the beach. For 30 minutes, commandos held a defensive perimeter in darkness, while landing craft navigated through rough seas. When boats arrived, commandos loaded the radar components and withdrew under fire. The entire operation, insertion, assault, technical dismantling, fighting withdrawal, evacuation, took 127 minutes. 2 commandos were killed, 6 wounded, 6 captured. They brought back the radar components and a German radar technician. The technical intelligence revolutionized British understanding of German radar systems and influenced RAF tactics for the rest of the war. But the operational impact exceeded the intelligence value. German coastal defenders realized that even supposedly secure installations could be penetrated, crucial equipment stolen, and attackers evacuated despite defensive responses. The Bruneval raid demonstrated that commandos weren't just raiders. They were capable of complex technical operations under combat conditions. Oberleutnant Werner von Mirbach, commanding the German garrison at Bruneval, wrote in his report, "The British moved through darkness with absolute confidence. They knew exactly where to go, what to target, how to withdraw. We were fighting in our own territory, supposedly defending a known position, yet they controlled the engagement entirely. It was like fighting men who could see in the dark while we stumbled blind. The psychological warfare aspect became deliberate. British planners recognized that commando raids' greatest value wasn't necessarily the targets destroyed, but the anxiety they created. Every raid forced Germany to strengthen coastal defenses, divert troops from other theaters, and maintain constant alertness along thousands of miles of coast. The Germans called it Nervenkrieg, War of Nerves. Soldiers stationed on coastal defense duty lived in perpetual anticipation of attacks that might never come to their sector. This psychological strain manifested in documented ways. German military medical reports from 1942-1943 showed increased rates of anxiety disorders, sleep disruption, and stress-related illness among coastal garrison troops. Soldiers on night watch reported seeing threats that weren't there, shapes in darkness, sounds that suggested infiltration, constant false alarms that eroded morale and effectiveness. The British deliberately reinforced this anxiety through disinformation. False radio traffic suggested raids that never occurred. RAF bombers would occasionally drop dummy parachutists over coastal areas, just bundles of straw with firecrackers, but enough to trigger massive German responses. Small boat patrols would approach shorelines and withdraw, forcing coastal garrisons to full alert status for nothing. The actual commando raids were rare, perhaps one every few weeks across the entire Atlantic and North Sea coasts. But the threat was constant. German commanders couldn't distinguish between real preparations and deception, so they had to treat every indication as genuine. This consumed resources and energy. More significantly, it created a sense among German coastal troops that they were facing an enemy who could strike anywhere, anytime with impunity. The reality was more complex. Commando operations were carefully planned, heavily rehearsed, and often supported by extensive intelligence. They weren't magically immune to casualties or failure. Several raids ended in disaster with heavy commando losses, but the German perception was what mattered, and that perception was of elite ghost warriors who owned the night and could penetrate any defense. This perception was reinforced by German propaganda's own mistakes. When raids succeeded, German authorities would often suppress information to avoid admitting vulnerability. This created information vacuums that rumors filled. Soldiers would hear whispered stories about commando raids that were exaggerated through retelling. The British raiders became, in German soldier folklore, almost superhuman, silent, deadly, appearing from nowhere, vanishing like smoke. The reality was impressive enough, the mythology made them terrifying. The technical sophistication of commando operations increased throughout 1942 and 1943. They weren't just shock troops, they became specialists in combined operations, integrating infantry assault, naval operations, air support, intelligence, and technical expertise into single cohesive missions. The training evolved to match this complexity. Commandos learned advanced navigation, radio operation, foreign languages, enemy equipment identification, and specialized skills like safe-cracking or lock-picking that seemed more appropriate for criminals than soldiers. This breadth of capability meant small commando teams could accomplish missions that would traditionally require much larger forces with specialized support. A 12-man commando team might include an explosives expert, a signals specialist, a medic, a linguist, and soldiers cross-trained in multiple roles. Each man was capable of taking over if others were killed or wounded. This redundancy made them remarkably resilient. Losing personnel didn't necessarily compromise the mission because remaining members could adapt and cover multiple roles. The Germans recognized this multi-capability training as a significant advantage. Traditional German infantry were excellently trained in their specific roles but less flexible. A machine gunner was a machine gunner. A radio man operated radios. If specialized personnel were casualties, their functions often couldn't be covered by others. Commandos, by contrast, were all-rounders first and specialists second. Equipment evolution also played a role. Commandos used specialized gear, suppressed weapons for silent killing, rubber-soled boots for quiet movement, waterproof watches and compasses, specialized climbing equipment, and various demolition tools. Much of this equipment was improvised or custom-made because standard military issue wasn't suitable for their missions. The famous Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, designed specifically for commandos, became iconic. A double-edged dagger optimized for silent killing. The knife itself was psychological warfare. When German soldiers found bodies killed with it, They knew commandos had been present. The weapon became synonymous with ghost-like night fighters. Navigation and timing received obsessive attention. Commando operations required precise coordination, landing at exact beaches, reaching objectives at specific times, synchronizing with naval pickup. They trained with stopwatches, learning to estimate time without checking watches, to calculate distances in darkness, to maintain schedule despite unexpected obstacles. This temporal precision was unusual in military operations, where delays and confusion were normal. Commandos treated time as a weapon, arriving exactly when expected, completing objectives within strict windows, vanishing on schedule. German defenders, conditioned to military operations running behind schedule, faced enemies who moved with clockwork precision through darkness. The human cost of this effectiveness was substantial. Commando casualty rates averaged 25–30% across major operations, far higher than conventional infantry. The selection and training process itself injured many candidates, some permanently. The operations were inherently high risk, small forces attacking defended positions, often without realistic prospect of reinforcement if things went wrong, yet recruitment never flagged. Men volunteered knowing the odds because the commandos offered something the regular army didn't: elite status, challenging missions, and the satisfaction of taking the fight to the enemy during years when Britain was largely on the defensive. The psychological profile of successful commandos revealed interesting patterns. They tended to be intelligent. Average IQ tests showed scores significantly above military norms. They were physically fit, but not necessarily the biggest or strongest. Endurance and pain tolerance mattered more than raw strength. Most importantly, they showed high tolerance for ambiguity and stress. They could function effectively when tired, scared, uncertain, and under fire. These psychological attributes couldn't really be trained. They had to be identified through selection. Training could enhance natural capabilities but couldn't create them in people who lacked the underlying traits. This is why washout rates remained high throughout the war. The commandos were extremely selective because the missions demanded capabilities not everyone possessed. The average commando was slightly older than typical infantry, mid-20s rather than late teens. This reflected the selection of experienced soldiers who'd proven themselves in conventional units before volunteering for special service. The maturity helped in high-stress situations requiring judgment and initiative. Officers and enlisted men trained together and lived together, an unusual arrangement in the class-conscious British military. This created unit cohesion that transcended rank. During operations, officers led from the front. Commando officer casualty rates were even higher than enlisted rates because officers took point positions in assaults. This leadership style built trust. Men would follow officers who shared their dangers. The training locations themselves became legendary. Achnacarry in the Scottish Highlands was the primary commando training center, a brutal facility where recruits spent weeks in miserable conditions, training with live ammunition, climbing mountains, conducting forced marches, and learning that comfort and safety were less important than mission completion. The final exercise was typically a 60-mile forced march in full gear, followed immediately by a combat assault course. Those who completed it were awarded the Green Beret, the commando symbol. The apogee of commando operations came with the increasingly complex missions of 1943–1944. Operations in Italy, Norway, and France demonstrated the evolution from simple raids to sophisticated strategic strikes. In Italy, commandos conducted beach reconnaissance before Allied landings, captured key bridges before they could be demolished, and eliminated defensive positions that threatened invasion forces. In Norway, they attacked heavy water production facilities critical to German atomic research, an operation that required parachute insertion, skiing through mountains in winter, precision demolition, and escape through hostile territory. The Telemark heavy water raid particularly captured imaginations. 6 Norwegian commandos infiltrated the Vemork facility, fought through security, destroyed production equipment, and escaped across mountains into Sweden. The operation set back German nuclear research by years and demonstrated that even heavily defended facilities deep in occupied territory were vulnerable to small, highly skilled teams. German security assessments after Telemark revealed institutional anxiety. If a facility considered impregnable could be penetrated and destroyed, what installation was truly safe? The raid forced Germany to dedicate additional resources to internal security, protecting facilities against infiltration rather than external attack. The psychological impact again exceeded the physical damage. By 1944, as D-Day approached, Commandos took on even more critical roles. They landed ahead of main invasion forces to secure beaches, capture guns covering landing zones, and clear obstacles. On D-Day itself, Commandos performed some of the most difficult missions. Lord Lavate's brigade captured the Orne Bridges, No. 4. Commando cleared Ouistreham, and specialized commandos neutralized coastal batteries. Their training in night operations, precision assault, and rapid objective capture made them ideal for missions that had to succeed. There was no plan B if beach clearance teams failed. German defenders at Normandy faced commandos among the first assault waves and reported experiences consistent with earlier raids. Enemy forces that moved with confidence in darkness and chaos, that seemed to know exactly what to do despite the confusion of combat, that fought with controlled aggression rather than panic. One German prisoner from the Merville Battery, a position captured by Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway's commandos in a desperate assault, described the experience. They came through our obstacles, through our wire, through our mines, and they kept coming. We shot many, but more kept coming. They were like ghosts who wouldn't die. When they reached our positions, they fought with knives and grenades close enough to touch. Then they were gone and the position was theirs. The German military response evolved throughout the war but never effectively countered the commando model. Germany created its own special forces units, the Brandenburgers being most comparable, but these operated within more conventional command structures and never achieved the autonomous operational capability that characterized British commandos. Several factors explain this. German military doctrine emphasized mass, coordination, and centralized command. Special forces could exist, but they were viewed as tactical support for conventional operations rather than strategic assets in their own right. The cultural element mattered too. British military culture tolerated eccentricity and initiative in ways German military culture, with its emphasis on discipline and obedience, didn't. The training that made commandos effective, teaching soldiers to think independently, make autonomous decisions, question orders that didn't make sense, would have been seen as undermining military discipline in the Wehrmacht. German coastal defenses became increasingly elaborate. More bunkers, more barbed wire, more minefields, more searchlights, more troops. The Atlantic Wall by 1944 represented massive investment in static defense. But static defenses, however strong, remained vulnerable to fast-moving attackers who could concentrate force at chosen points and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. The defensive mindset inherent in static fortifications played to commando strengths. A captured German defensive plan from 1943 revealed the strategic dilemma. The document noted that adequate defense of all potential landing sites would require 3 times available troop strength. Concentrating forces at likely landing zones left other areas vulnerable. Maintaining reserves for rapid response consumed resources needed elsewhere. The plan concluded pessimistically. Complete defense against British raiding forces is impossible with available resources. We can only minimize damage and respond as quickly as possible after attacks begin. That conclusion, from German strategic planners, represented admission that the commando model had no perfect counter. The mathematics of defense versus offense favored the raiders overwhelmingly. A dozen commandos could force the deployment of hundreds of defenders across potential target areas. Even successful defenses, raids repelled or commandos killed, consumed resources and attention disproportionate to the attacking force. The post-raid German process became standardized. Investigate how defenses were penetrated, strengthen the specific vulnerabilities exploited, brief other coastal positions about new tactics observed. But this reactive approach meant Germany was always responding to the last raid, rather than anticipating the next. Commandos, meanwhile, studied German defensive improvements and adapted their tactics accordingly. The innovation cycle favored the attackers. Individual German soldier accounts collected after the war provided the most visceral descriptions of facing commandos. These testimonials appeared in interviews, memoirs, and military history research projects over subsequent decades. Unteroffizier Hans Schreiber, who fought commandos during the Saint-Nazaire raid, described the experience in a 1968 interview. I was on the dock when the destroyer rammed the gates. At first I thought it was an accident, a navigation error perhaps. Then men poured off the ship like ants from a disturbed nest. They moved so fast, so purposefully. I shot at them. Others shot at them, but they seemed to flow around bullets like water around stones. They disappeared into shadows, reappeared behind us, threw grenades, fired weapons, then vanished again. I never felt I was fighting an army. It was like fighting individual hunters who happened to be coordinated. Each one seemed to know exactly what to do without being told. When our officers tried to organize counterattack, the British were already gone. We were still forming up to respond to the first attack when explosions told us they'd hit 3 other targets we hadn't even known were threatened. Gefreiter Wolfgang Lehmann, stationed in Norway, recounted night patrols after commando raids. We knew they were out there, somewhere. British raiders, maybe Norwegian resistance, maybe both. Walking patrol at night became psychological torture. Every shadow might hide a knife. Every sound might be them approaching. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my rifle. We were supposed to be the defenders, but we felt hunted. I remember thinking, this isn't war as I understood it. War is armies fighting armies. This was something else, predators hunting prey, and we were the prey. Obergefreiter Friedrich Meyer described the aftermath of a commando raid on a coastal radar station. They came in darkness, killed the sentries silently. We found the bodies with throats cut, destroyed the equipment with precisely placed explosives, and disappeared. The entire attack took perhaps 10 minutes. We were garrisoned just 300 meters away and heard nothing until the explosions. By the time we reached the radar station, they were gone. Not retreating. Gone. Vanished. We searched for hours and found nothing. No tracks, no equipment dropped, no trace except the bodies in destruction. It was as if ghosts had done it. The technical analysis of why commandos were so effective in night operations revealed several factors working in combination. First, the intensive training in darkness gave them confidence and capability that darkness-phobic defenders lacked. Humans are naturally day-oriented. Night reduces visibility, distorts sound, triggers fear responses. Commandos trained until these natural responses were overcome. They learned to move confidently in darkness, to trust their night-adapted vision, to navigate by feel and sound as much as sight. Second, the offensive mindset trumped defensive psychology. Commandos knew what they intended to do. Defenders only knew something might happen. This psychological asymmetry meant commandos were mentally prepared and focused, while defenders were anxious and reactive. When contact occurred, commandos executed rehearsed actions while defenders responded to unexpected situations. The initiative advantage was decisive. Third, the training emphasis on speed and violence of action created tactical momentum that defensive positions couldn't match. Commandos would hit objectives hard and fast, overwhelming defenders through shock and aggression before organized resistance could form. By the time defenders understood what was happening and organized response, commandos were already withdrawing or moving to next objectives. Fourth, the small unit structure allowed tactical flexibility impossible in larger formations. A 12-man commando team could split into smaller elements, attack from multiple directions, create confusion about force size and location, and concentrate at critical points. Defenders couldn't tell if they faced 12 men or 120. The darkness and tactical sophistication suggested larger forces than actually existed. Fifth, the specialized equipment, suppressed weapons, explosives, navigation tools, communications gear, gave commandos technical advantages in close-quarters night combat. Suppressed Sten guns meant defenders often couldn't locate shooters by muzzle flash or sound. Directional explosives destroyed targets with minimal collateral damage and predictable effects. Signal flares and coordinated timing allowed complex synchronized actions. Finally, the psychological preparation, training that included live fire exercises, realistic stress, simulated casualties, meant commandos maintained effectiveness under combat stress that would paralyze normal soldiers. They'd experienced comparable fear and confusion in training, so combat felt manageable. German defensive troops, by contrast, often experienced their first serious combat during commando raids, with all the psychological shock that entailed. These factors combined to create the ghost effect. Enemies who appeared from nowhere, fought with supernatural effectiveness and vanished without trace. The lasting impact of commando operations extended far beyond the immediate military effects. The commandos established templates that every modern special forces unit follows: selective recruitment, brutal training, emphasis on night operations, small unit tactics, multi-domain capability, and psychological as well as physical warfare. After World War II, the British Commandos were partially disbanded, then reformed as Royal Marine Commandos, continuing the tradition with updated tactics and equipment. but the influence spread globally. The American Rangers were directly modeled on British Commandos. The 1st Ranger Battalion trained at Achnacarry in Scotland under British Commando instructors. American Special Forces doctrine, from Rangers to Navy SEALs, draws heavily from Commando techniques and philosophy. Soviet Spetsnaz, Israeli Special Forces, and elite units worldwide studied commando operations and adopted core principles. The ghost reputation became part of military legend. Even today, stories about British commandos in World War II circulate in military training environments as examples of what elite soldiers can achieve. The emphasis on night operations, in particular, became universal in special operations forces. Every modern special operations unit trains extensively for darkness because the commandos proved its tactical value. The psychological warfare dimension influenced post-war military thinking about asymmetric conflict. The commandos demonstrated that small elite forces could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their size by creating psychological impacts that exceeded physical damage. This lesson informed counterinsurgency doctrine, special operations theory, and thinking about force multiplication. The German soldiers who survived fighting commandos carried memories that shaped their post-war perspectives. Many wrote memoirs or gave interviews that consistently described the experience as unlike conventional combat, more personal, more terrifying, more psychologically impactful. They'd faced enemies who seemed to operate by different rules, who appeared from darkness like vengeful spirits, who fought with intensity that suggested something beyond normal military motivation. The ghost description appeared repeatedly across different accounts, different theaters, different years, suggesting it wasn't exaggeration but genuine perception. These soldiers had faced perhaps the most elite infantry force of the war, trained to a standard and with techniques that Wehrmacht forces had no frame of reference to understand. The experience left lasting impressions precisely because it contradicted everything their training and doctrine had taught them about how soldiers fought and how battles unfolded. The ultimate validation of commando effectiveness came not from British assessments but from enemy admission. In May 1945, as Germany surrendered, Allied intelligence teams interviewed captured German officers systematically about their wartime experiences. The interviews about commando operations revealed consistent themes across ranks, units, and theaters. General Major Wilhelm Richter, who'd commanded coastal defense forces in Normandy, provided perhaps the most comprehensive assessment. The British commandos represented a form of warfare we were conceptually unprepared for. Our doctrine emphasized mass, firepower, and coordinated operations. We understood defense through fortification and numerical superiority. The commandos ignored these paradigms entirely. They attacked with small numbers, achieved effects through precision rather than mass, and disappeared before we could bring our advantages to bear. More troubling was the psychological dimension. My soldiers knew the commandos existed and might strike at any time. This knowledge eroded combat effectiveness even when no actual raids occurred. Men became nervous, trigger-happy, exhausted from hypervigilance. We couldn't sustain alert status indefinitely, but we couldn't predict when attacks would come. The commandos owned the initiative completely. We were reactive, always responding, never dictating terms. In conventional warfare, defenders hold advantage. Fortified positions, familiar terrain, prepared fields of fire. Against commandos, these advantages became liabilities. Our fortifications pinned us to static locations while they moved freely. Our positions were visible to them while they remained invisible to us. Our numerical superiority meant nothing because we couldn't concentrate force against enemies who appeared and vanished like ghosts. If I were asked to list the 3 most effective British military innovations of the war, I would include radar technology, which gave them air defense superiority, intelligence operations, which broke our codes, and the commandos, which demonstrated that elite infantry, properly trained and employed, could achieve strategic impact far exceeding their numbers. The commandos weren't invincible. We killed many, captured some, repelled raids occasionally. But we never solved the fundamental problem they posed. We never stopped fearing the night. We never achieved the same capabilities. We never countered their model effectively. In the end, they were simply better at this type of warfare than we were, better trained, better led, better motivated, better adapted to darkness and chaos in close combat. We admitted this privately, though not publicly during the war, but it was true. The British commandos exist today in evolved form. Royal Marine Commandos and Special Boat Service continuing traditions established 80 years ago. The Green Beret remains the symbol, the training at Limpstone remains brutal, and the standards remain extremely selective. Modern technology has changed equipment and communications, but core principles endure. Recruit the right people, train them harder than combat demands, teach them to operate in darkness and uncertainty, and trust them to accomplish impossible missions. The Ghost reputation persists, not as mythology, but as recognition of genuine capability earned through documented operations, where small teams achieved objectives that conventional forces couldn't approach. The German soldiers who fought them weren't exaggerating or making excuses. They faced enemies who operated at a level of training, sophistication, and psychological preparation that Wehrmacht forces rarely encountered. The admission that commandos fought like ghosts at night was accurate description of tactical superiority in specific operational domains. The legacy extends beyond military applications. The commando model influenced thinking about elite performance in many fields. The importance of selection over training, the value of stress inoculation, the power of small teams with high trust and competence, the strategic impact of precision over mass. Organizations from business to athletics have studied commando training and doctrine looking for applicable principles. The human cost deserves final acknowledgement. Over 1,700 commandos died during World War II, roughly 25% of total commando strength. Thousands more were wounded or captured. These weren't abstract casualties. They were men who volunteered for hazardous duty, trained to extraordinary standards, and died executing missions designed to be nearly impossible. Their effectiveness shouldn't obscure their sacrifice. They weren't actually ghosts. They were soldiers who learned to fight like ghosts through obsessive training and controlled aggression. When German soldiers described facing enemies who appeared from darkness, fought with supernatural skill and vanished without trace, they were describing the apex of light infantry capability, humans trained to exceed normal human limitations in specific operational contexts. The darkness wasn't magic, it was mastery. The ghost-like qualities weren't supernatural, they were skills developed through relentless preparation and selection of exceptional individuals. The British Commandos proved that small numbers of highly capable soldiers, properly trained and employed, could achieve strategic effects that conventional forces 10 times their size couldn't match. They owned the night because they learned to love darkness that others feared. They fought like ghosts because they trained until the impossible became routine, until fear became fuel, until darkness became advantage. And German soldiers admitted this not from weakness but from respect, acknowledging that they'd faced something genuinely exceptional, something their own doctrine couldn't replicate or counter. In war's brutal accounting, that admission represents the highest possible validation.